Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Pleasure to talk to you this afternoon. I've prepared this presentation more or less as a personal reflection on a year and a half's experience of authorization in the RAC. I was helped with comments from Lena and Betty, who are here in the room, so thank you for that, and also Urs, who's not with us. Largely, these are my reflections rather than the committee, so just to be clear. What do RAC and SEAC actually do with authorizations? Sometimes it's better to go back to basics and have a real look. RAC recommends on adequate control for threshold substances. It also recommends on whether the operational conditions, risk management measures in place are appropriate and effective in limiting the risks from non-threshold substances. That's the language we currently use in the opinions. We also recommend on additional conditions such as monitoring arrangements which may be needed. And then finally, at the end of each opinion, more or less, we also advise SEAC, if there's any need, to alter the review period from the standard. Standard is usually taken as 7 years, and that would be primarily due to remaining risk concerns. That's what we do in the RAC. Now, I'm going to do a bit of analysis over the next few slides to try and give you an impression of what we've encountered and what we would like to encounter. Just starting with adequate control versus non-threshold. We've seen proposals for adequate control, which were perfectly adequately controlled in as far as we could see. So our evaluation was positive in those cases, and you've heard a couple of them mentioned earlier on today. We've also seen adequate control cases which, to our mind, were clearly not adequately controlled, and we've had to deal with that in committee as we went forward. An adequate control case which becomes not adequately controlled, of course, needs a whole further set of steps to get it through. That caused certain problems for a while, but I think we got through it and came to opinions which adequately reflected the risks which we had seen. And that's what we've tried to do all along in discharging our responsibilities as a committee. For the non-threshold substances, carcinogens, but also the PBTs, we've also had an opportunity to look at the various types of application and the differences which these applications present to us. We've also got through them, I think, in a fairly adequate way. Some were relatively straightforward, well presented, well prepared. Others presented more difficulties, and I'll come to some of those things in a minute. What do we look for in an evaluation? These are just fairly mechanical steps. How did it get onto Annex 14 is a good starting point. Description of the industrial process, fairly key to any application, operational conditions, and the context of representative workplaces. And I'm going to be repeating that word again and again over the next 15 minutes. Risk management measures currently in place. We have seen some future risk management measures, some more convincing than others, but that's an approach as well, provided you can corroborate that it's actually going to happen. But I think we're looking for what is actually there. We review the exposures, mainly who is exposed to what, where, for how long, and how often. That would be both via the inhalation and dermal route. We review the risk estimate presented by the applicant. We back-check them. We do some recalculation. We don't do the work for the applicant. It's entirely up to them. We do provide comments fairly comprehensively. And we look at the risks of alternative substances or technologies, usually using comparison of hazard as a surrogate for risk. Digging down, rapporteur's experience so far. It's really critical that the committee can understand the process. Diagrams, photographs, videos all help in that understanding. It just enhances the dry words on a page. Evaluation of applications has been complicated by unrealistic confidentiality claims. If you really don't need to do that, please don't. It really makes life difficult for rapporteurs, for committee members, and for the Secretariat in trying to handle these applications. I'll give you an example. Even after we've sorted out a lot of issues to do with confidentiality, last week we get a set of responses to rapporteur's questions back from an applicant, and all of the responses are marked confidential. So how are we supposed to discuss them with the full committee? You really need to think about these kind of very basic issues when you're dealing with a committee and dealing with essential safety information. RAC reference values, DNLs, dose response curves, where they're not used, justification for other values was generally insufficient in all cases. And it was generally not even in line with ECHA guidance. So, you know, there's a fair lesson to be learned there, I think. Information on hazard and risk of alternatives was often lacking or only poorly developed. Some cases it was there, but it was very premature. We had difficulties getting around that in a couple of cases. On a more positive note, this is sort of a general set of reflections, trialogues were seen by the rapporteurs generally as being useful. I think by ECHA Secretariat as very useful, mainly in clarifying details of the application, not necessarily in providing us with any new information. But the opportunity to talk to the applicant, I think we felt was extremely positive. One thing to be aware of, the timelines might be short for you as an applicant, but we have no luxury in longer timelines either. It's just as difficult on this side. So this, in a way, is a collaborative effort to get things through. Down another level on our experiences as committee and rapporteurs, operational conditions and risk management measures. We've seen plenty of closed systems, and some of them really were closed, and you could convince us that they were closed. But we've seen others where these claims were not really substantiated. So we're left with a feeling of, well, what's really there? General and local exhaust ventilation, not always specified in terms of siting or effectiveness. So you could have helped cases by being just a little more specific on this. Description of the overall sequence of activities in the process, absolutely essential for understanding it, but not always complete. Sometimes it's patchy, we have to go back and ask questions to clarify. And this is really where most of the dialogue during the rapporteur's questions and the trialogue focuses on getting these aspects into line. Simple things like good practice documentation for relevant parts of the process. Even if they are in another language, we can still probably manage to do something with them. Could help us to understand. Was often lacking. Personal protective equipment, getting down into fairly fine detail. Routine use is generally a last resort. At least that's in our understanding. So over-reliance forces the committee members to start to ask questions. For example, when we see very high efficiency personal protective equipment being claimed, we start to wonder, okay, how can you substantiate that that is actually protecting the workers? We prefer, I think after a lot of consideration, exposure and risk to be expressed with and without personal protective equipment. That makes it much clearer, much easier to understand what's going on. If it's not available without, then we need to know the efficiency of the equipment, and that can get quite complicated. On exposure itself, applications are sometimes very general and lack focus on exposure to the actual Annex 14 substance. Process descriptions and sequence of process steps often vague. How many people are involved in doing what particular task, where and how long per shift? What are they doing the rest of the time, which could lead to further exposure to the same chemical? Relevant exposure measurements are often sparse, sometimes very sparse. Relevant exposure could be the Annex 14 substance, inhalation or dermal measurements, or it could be to analogous substances which are being measured and which give you an idea of the behavior of the Annex 14 one. So there is a surrogate approach possible there. Exposure modeling, sometimes lacking, sometimes there, often insufficiently documented, whereas it could have improved several cases considerably. It's a relatively simple backstop to help the sparse measurements. I think the take-home message here is that try and corroborate the evidence you're presenting wherever possible. If you can do that, it helps the application enormously. What have we received in terms of exposure data? We've had exclusively measured data and been able to deal with it, air monitoring and or biomonitoring. In some cases, we've had fairly neat juxtaposition of air monitoring and biomonitoring, which gave us a good feeling of reliability. We've seen exclusively modeled data. As such, not a problem provided it's properly done. but some corroboration with modeled or with measured data is always helpful and desirable. We've seen literature data used, mostly measured, including industry surveys, epidemiology surveys, etc. And we've seen evidence of compliance with thresholds set by voluntary industry agreements. So really the whole gamut, and in various mixtures in various dossiers. I think the corroboration word is the one that I wanted to impress there. We do have a strong preference for measured data. Let's be perfectly clear. If modeling is the only option, corroborate. This enhances the evaluation. We have seen monitoring programs initiated fairly close to the date of application, and sometimes during the preparation of the dossier, in several applications. I'm pretty convinced that the results help build the cases and are certainly very relevant for reapplication should the need arise. Switch to a slightly different topic. It was touched on by a couple of the earlier speakers, but I wanted to deal with it in a little bit more detail. Finding the right scale for an application is clearly an issue. It's one that affects your applications, and it's one that affects our evaluation in committee. We've seen single workplaces. If they're well described, it should be fairly quick through committee and a fairly easy job to evaluate and recommend. We've seen ones slightly more complex for several workplaces, where there's a clear connection between 2 or 3 workplaces. Again, relatively easy to decide on in most cases. We've seen trickier ones with the one-to-many type of formula. So very similar workplaces, for example, a formulator, then sold on to professional downstream users, where you go to one to very, very many. Not really compact application anymore, but still workable in the sense that it was possible to evaluate. The one thing I wanted to remind about is that operational conditions, task-based activities, risk management measures affecting exposure workers in the context of each workplace need to be clearly described. And if the workplaces are similar, that's not a really big ask. It's a question of replication and showing us the nuances. On the upstream side, manufacturer applications, also large downstream user consortium applications, they may be efficient, but they can have other drawbacks. I've tried to list some of the main ones we encountered here without wanting to put anybody off. There's a tendency to rely on generic data. So open literature, voluntary emission standards, whatever's there. Those are really difficult, if not impossible, to evaluate unless you can show the source material that it's based on. Give us something to convince us that this is actually the case in the workplaces you're trying to apply for. Operational conditions and risk management measures still need to be clearly described. Well-described examples in a really big application of representative workplaces with justification really are what we need. They can help the bigger applications through. And I think that's something to be very much aware of. There's the transnational aspect to these big ones as well. Several have been broadly transnational, I mean virtually the whole EU. An indication of geographical variability is really necessary. So in other words, data on trends in operational conditions, risk management measures, and how they change with location. East to west, north to south, that sort of thing. Coming towards a close here, I don't see any orange lights yet. So, okay, I'll use my own orange lights here. Let's see what we've done in recommendations, what we've actually sent on to the Commission. If adequate control of risks was demonstrated by the applicant, it's fairly easy. So far, no conditions additional to those proposed in the application. Occasionally conditions for a possible review. I'll come to the review on a final slide. Certainly no recommendation to SEAC on the review period necessary. Where adequate control is not demonstrated or the risks are not adequately limited in non-threshold cases, the degree of failure is really critical to the next steps. And that's, I think, where we've put a lot of effort in committee in trying to get this balance right. If the operational conditions risk measures are not adequately described, then really we've very little choice but to recommend specific conditions or additional risk management measures. That's a tricky thing to do in big applications, where the workplace descriptions are a little bit fuzzy. And that's a problem going forward. We can include monitoring arrangements. We have done in several applications, and I think justifiably so. And in several, we've recommended a short review period to SEAC and the Commission. And in a number of cases, SEAC has agreed with us, and the recommendation has gone forward from the committees as a short review. We've also had cases where, in RAC, in any case, the application could not be evaluated. Rejection or stringent conditions in special cases are really the only option left. And we've had one of the latter of those. We've used all of the above except rejection so far. Every one of them. I don't rule out any rejections, but we'll see as we go forward. Each one gets evaluated on its merits. I'd like to just finish up on a long-term view. There's one slide after this, I'll try to get through quickly, of our experiences. What we've been attempting to do is to plan for the future, knowing that what we recommend now, if it goes into legislation, may automatically mean that somebody's coming back to have their application reviewed. So we've been looking at this with the review process firmly in mind. So where there are remaining uncertainties and there's a short review period, of course, things come back quicker. And it's mainly about the exposure assessment we're concerned about in those cases. So really we're trying to encourage applicants to work on the weaknesses of their first application. And when they come back, or if they come back, to come back with a much clearer, strengthened application which is easier and more efficient to evaluate. Where necessary, we apply monitoring arrangements. The data can be inspected by enforcement authorities and should be tailored for use as part of any review by the committees. We would really like to see evaluation on review simpler, clearer, more efficient. Just one last thing on the RAC reference values to finish off. It's a bit of a non sequitur, but I think it's worth saying. We've provided DNLs, or dose-response relationships, on a pilot basis, at least that's what we agreed on at the beginning, for almost all substances so far. I think the one exception which we missed was the Repro 1B classification for lead, if I'm correct. We didn't actually have a DNL ready for that. The way it works is a background report is prepared by a consultant to ECHA, and a reference value note is prepared for agreement in committee. That passes through committee, and then it's published on the ECHA website and made available to anybody who wants to use it. It's not just helping industry, it's also helping ourselves and shortening the debates in committee and increasing efficiency enormously. Large majority of the applications to date have used the RAC reference values. Only a handful have not. Many of the applications have had a very short hazard section of the CSR because of that. We think that's very effective. We think in our terms it's saved up to about 30% of rapporteurs' time in having to prepare these sequentially for multiple substances, and it saves time in plenary as well. We think it also saves your time. At the start, we were reasonably late in publishing the notes. We listened to feedback which we got through various conferences and workshops, and we're now publishing much earlier. We may still not be early enough, but we're doing our best. We would like to continue the program, but we would appreciating your views informally at this meeting would be helpful, or in writing if you like. It's something which is quite important going forward. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.